everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for class for Monday, the 6th of December, where we are talking about The Exorcist. And you can see in the notes below, I've included a link to where you can find the text online if it turns out that you don't have access to the text itself. And also in the second part of our notes, you can see that I've included a link for the movie trailer. And it's the movie trailer from 1973, so I encourage you to watch it to try to give you a sense of the time period. And I had asked you a couple of classes ago, I believe, to watch the documentary about The Exorcist, where it led to this kind of cultural mass hysteria. Now, in terms of the background of the film, it's loosely based on documented exorcisms. And the focus, obviously, is on what Stephen King would call the gross out, trying to basically, both the text and the film, trying to literally gross out the audience. In fact, it actually earned an X rating in Boston, a little bit of trivia. And Regan McNeil, as the possessed child, breaks all kinds of societal and cultural taboos. Is one of the reasons why people responded so viscerally to it. Now, as you know, usually I've been showing films for all of our texts. Now, the problem with The Exorcist is twofold. The first is that it's very graphic, so that this is a film that I don't require students to watch, though I usually provide it as an option. But the second problem is the copyright issue, and that I cannot find a free version online. That said, you have multiple options to rent it for $2.99, whether it be through Amazon Prime or Google Play or Apple TV or even YouTube. Again, you don't need to watch the particular film, but if you are curious or interested, certainly you can, and at least the trailer will give you a little bit of a sense as to how the film would have been promoted during the time period. Some of the themes, because I suspect you probably have not finished reading the text yet, and the good news perhaps is that the author of the text, William Peter Blatty, worked very closely with William Friedkin, who was the director of the movie, so they are both quite similar. The distinction being that the movie leaves out sections based on time. And if you were to watch the extended version of The Exorcist, which was not shown in 1973, and it's entitled The Version You've Never Seen Before, which I think is a problematic title because once you've seen it, then obviously it's the version you haven't seen before. But there's additional footage, and some of it I think is important because there is a scene there where the exorcist, Karen and Marin, are talking about the purpose of and the rationale for possession. And that's something that I wanted us to focus on as well. I think that this text has always been misread and misviewed. The focus is, based on the title, supposed to be The Exorcist. And there are two exorcists in this text and also in the film, Father Karras and Father Marin. And both of them are tormented by inner demons. And I think that really is the way to read this text rather than thinking about it from the gross out factor of Regan McNeil. And the hero, as we've seen in other texts before, is Christianity. Christianity serves as savior. We're also introduced to Regan's mother. Her name is Chris. Notice how close that is to the name of Christ. And she too has her own inner demons of guilt and privilege. I'd argue that's really one of the best ways to read this particular text. She is a very wealthy actress, and basically an actor lies for living. She lives near a church in Washington, D.C., so she's convenient in terms of location. She is an atheist, again, that would perhaps make her a prime target. She is divorced, so there's some social commentary here in the film. And there's also a Ouija board in the house. So when you put all of these things together, as well as the temptation of choosing not just a child, because the corruption of child is always so horrific, but the corruption of female child, and we get a very sweet and innocent Regan in the beginning, and then we see how ultimately she's tormented and soiled as the text continues on. There are other characters as well in the text that are rather simplified in the film. One is Bert Dennings. He happens to be the movie producer for Chris, and he is tormented, I would argue. His inner demon is alcohol. And if you want to think about the 1970s and the turmoil and torment of the 1970s, it was a time of Vietnam with a good number of campus protests. In fact, there even is a scene where the actor Chris McNeil is actually putting forth a scene for a movie about campus protests. It was a time of some rather liberal drug use and abuse, where youth were seen as kind of monstrosities that needed to, in one way or another, be controlled, especially if they were on drugs. It almost seemed as if they were possessed. And the world seemed to be going to hell. So you put all of these pieces together, and what you've got is The Exorcist. And again, I encourage you to read, and if you decide to watch the movie, view it from the perspective of the exorcist, not necessarily from the perspective of the possessed child. There's a good amount of symbolism in this film, something we've talked about in other texts, such as doors. We talked about this with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are a good number of shots in the film, for instance, that feature doors, and the author, William Peter Blatty, talked about how he very deliberately wanted to focus on doors. So did William Friedkin, the director, as a kind of entryway into the supernatural or into the psyche. And much like we've seen with other Gothic texts, we're going to get a good amount of ambiguity as to whether or not the events are physiological or whether they are psychological or whether they are paranormal or whether they are supernatural. And I suspect, and in terms of the ways of that one could read this text, that probably the more accurate reading might be to say that it's all of the above. Especially people who viewed the film would talk about that oftentimes the scenes shown of the medical community and trying to determine how the little girl is acting in the way that she is and why. That some of those scenes are perhaps some of the most horrific. Of course, there is the psychological, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, particularly from the perspective of Regan McNeil, but also from the other characters as well, and some of their issues and some of their inner demons, if you will. There is the idea of paranormal that we talked about in The Haunting of Hill House, for instance. Notice that Regan McNeil is just the right age for poltergeist activity. She's right on the cusp of adolescence, and she also is female. In fact, when I talked about that this film was loosely based on documented exorcisms, also from the Bible, but there was one that was quite famous from, I believe it was the 1940s, and it was of a young boy. And I think that it's very deliberate that William Peter Blatty, the author, changed it to a young girl so that we could have this possibility, even more so, of poltergeist activity. And then, of course, the supernatural, where we are introduced to a demon, Pazuzu. And the beginning of the text, as well as the beginning of the film, is Iraq, which is supposed to be reputedly the site of the biblical Garden of Eden and the fall of man. So that gives us the religious context. But do think about the evils of wealth versus poverty, especially the idea that we've seen in something like texts like Jekyll and Hyde that seem to be rather contemporary for texts like The Exorcist, where both can exist side by side. I also wanted to draw your attention to some due dates since we're headed towards the ending of the semester. That your 7th journal on The Exorcist will be due on the 13th of December. That's next Monday, so that we've got a little bit of time to talk about the text itself. And then on the 20th, which is also on Monday, a week later, this is when your paper number 2 is due. Certainly you can hand in your paper number 2 earlier, but you definitely want to hand in your paper number 2 by that point because that is the date, believe it or not, of our final examination. So the semester will be over at that point. And what I'm going to do is post our final exam at 8 a.m. in the morning as if we were meeting in person on Monday the 20th. If we were meeting in person, you'd have 2 hours to answer the final exam. But since we aren't meeting in person, I'm going to give you 24 hours to answer the final exam. It's open book, open notes. I would have done that whether we were meeting in person or if we are meeting online. And certainly I don't expect anything as neat or as polished or well developed as what you would do in a paper. But what I'm hoping that you can do during the final exam is synthesize all of the major points that we've been discussing over the semester. So if you've been doing the readings and submitting in your journals and listening to the videos, it should just be a way for you to compile all of that. It's going to be an essay exam. Again, open book, open notes, so you can reference things like journals and papers and so forth. And I will have a series of essay questions from which you can choose. And that final exam would be due 24 hours later, which would be Tuesday the 21st at 8 a.m. So that also would be the ending of our semester. So for today's attendance question, and this is via our class discussion forum, as it usually is, this will be due on Tuesday the 7th by 8 a.m., is why do you think most individuals focus on the possessed girl, Reagan, rather than the exorcist, Marin and Karis, in The Exorcist? So I'm curious to see what your speculation might be. Again, next class we'll talk a little bit more about The Exorcist as well as paper number 2. As you know, paper number 2 is very similar to paper number 1. The distinction being that you're talking about the latter set of readings that the semester was devoted to. So your options would be things like Dracula, for instance, or Lovecraft, for instance, or The Haunting of Hill House, for instance, or The Exorcist, for instance. Even Stephen King, that's how we are going to be ending our semester, with a couple of his short stories, just to give you a sense of what his writing is like. If you wanted to earn a little bit of extra credit for the class, you could always submit in a journal for those short stories that I've assigned for Stephen King. And once you see those stories, I think you'll understand why I had assigned those particular pieces. But I did not assign a formal journal for Stephen King because that is going to be our very final class before we move into our final examination. So I hope you are all doing well. I'll end it here for those of you who are thinking that you might want to watch the film. If you don't want to watch the film, the trailer is a couple of minutes long. So basically you've got time to finish up with the text if you don't watch the film. And we will continue on next class talking about The Exorcist. Take care. Bye-bye.